I'm super excited to be joined today by Jon Favreau, who was a speechwriter for Obama, but perhaps most famously to a huge audience is a host of Pod Save America. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you is because in some ways we have kind of different but overlapping audiences. And, this project of running for office in 2019, 2020, the goal is just to build a coalition big enough to beat Donald Trump, right? And so to the extent that there's any kind of lingering issues or divisions between kind of the center left or left factions, I want to kind of talk through them with you as someone who's kind of an expert, I think, on one cohort and me maybe coming from another cohort about what kind of gains to trade we can find and what overlap we can find and like how to kind of resolve any lingering issues that might still persist.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because I think about this sort of from like two different perspectives. One, there's clearly some hard feelings when you between the left and liberals when you're scrolling through Twitter every day. I don't know that those divisions are there among most voters as much, like because you guys have seen this when you look at polls. Like most people in the Democratic Party, Democrats who voted for Hillary Clinton, like Bernie. Vice versa. Like a lot of Bernie supporters, would happily voted for Hillary Clinton and like Democrats. And so I do think there are real substantive policy differences and political differences, but I think it's probably important to start with the fact that they get magnified on Twitter by sort of activists on both sides who sort of like do this for a living. And I've got caught up in that myself, like I think there's just something about the medium that when you're arguing and fighting, like you sort of go a little overboard and then those divisions harden as a result.
Really important distinction to make. And I want to pick up on something that you said. You described it as a left liberal divide. And even those terms can be really charged, right? People throw around left, liberal, centrist, neoliberal, progressive, all of these terms are out there. And sometimes when I'm even trying to talk about this, I find myself tripping over my words because I don't want to
Me too.
I don't want to use a term that someone finds alienating, but I also am trying to be descriptive in a way that I do think is meaningful.
Yeah. No, and I just said left and liberal, and I don't even use the same terminology all the time myself. Like I don't really know because also if you ask me like how I describe myself, I'd probably just say I'm a progressive Democrat, but other people might think differently. Other people might call me a neoliberal shill. Like, I don't know.
we won't be calling anybody that around here. But like last night, we're recording this the day after the first night of the second Democratic Party debates. And at some point, last night it really highlighted the extent to which there are two factions within the Democratic Party, however you want to define them, but a more left faction and a more centrist faction, let's say. And a member of the more centrist faction last night, Bullock actually described himself as a progressive. He says, I'm a progressive, emphasis on progress. And I think when things like that happen, when you have such clear lines delineated, and then someone on the less progressive group is owning that term, that's where you get some of this frustration about, like the term policing. Like, who are you to say this? And then that isn't entirely distinct from the policy conversation, right? Because there is also, what was also happening on stage was a bunch of people who had maintained their commitment to Medicare for all, and Medicare for all being a single-payer healthcare system, who in the last couple of days or week or so have begun to distance themselves from the program, from Medicare for all, by putting forth their own policies that are not, in fact, single-payer as we all understand Medicare to be. So I don't think it's just a semantic debate. And I want to ask, what did you make of the debate performances last night and the factions that emerged between kind of Bernie and Warren and basically the rest of the crowd?
Yeah, I mean, so let's take the example of healthcare, right? So obviously Bernie's been for single payer for many, many, many years, right? But I would say in 2009, when we were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, sort of the left position or the progressive position during that debate was including a public option, right? There was no like serious proposal that that went beyond a public option, right, in that debate. And now, there's a whole bunch of candidates that are proposing a public option, but you have like, Kamala Harris and, Beto O'Rourke's Medicare for America, right? Those two policies, if they had been proposed in 2009 by members of Congress during the debate of the Affordable Care Act, would have been seen as very lefty progressive policies. I mean, it is, we're talking about automatic enrollment. In Kamala's case, you're obviously going to get to single payer at the end of 10 years, even if you have some, a few, Medicare private plans on the market as well. But there's a very progressive position. Now they're seen, someone talked about, I think, Medicare for America last night, Beto's plan in the opening as like the moderate position. And it's funny because I guess it's a moderate position compared to the fact that we have two major candidates, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, talking about single payer Medicare for all, but it's all relative speaking. Now, to me, I also think that is a testament to the left and to activists that they have, and I said this to Senator Sanders during our interview, that they have pushed the entire debate over healthcare to the left so that now we are having a debate between the public option, which was the left position in 2009, and actual single payer.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important point, that the term progressive, it is ultimately, I think it always will be a relative term. And I think that that's where part of the problem comes, is when change happens rather quickly. And you've seen this in other areas, like the quickness with which the world has shifted on LGBTQIA issues, right? There are people who maybe aren't the worst, but who kind of have this Archie Bunker mentality, because it's like, yeah, I want to get on board, but like now I've got to say what now, and pronouns, and they get caught up in that sort of thing. And, with time will probably come around that are not like hardened bigots. And I think there's a version of that with policies, right?
Yeah.
Where there are people who are used to seeing themselves as progressives, who, because this new flank has emerged, are unsettled by the idea that they wouldn't be sitting in the most left position. And there's a way that we can kind of identify as, the most left person or the most progressive person. And when that becomes no longer the case, there's like two reactions you can have. You can say, oh, well, cool, there's this new panoply of options available, let me hop on board, or let me dig in my heels and kind of defend my turf and kind of be resentful of the idea that my identity is being challenged in this way. And sometimes I feel like that is what's going on. And I'm very sensitive to that, because I think that those people aren't people who disagree per se, but who need to be made to feel like they are a part of this change, as opposed to kind of like a fatality or like a consequence of the change.
I think it's a very important point, because I think, look, this since you're on a campaign, right? Like, the purpose of building a movement, right, is to enact a political and social change. And to grow that movement, you need to persuade others to join it. And to persuade others to join it, it has to be more welcoming. Here's our ideas. They're great. Please come join us in this movement. And sometimes I feel like the arguments between sort of the center left and left of the party are more about like, I don't want to persuade you of my ideas. I want to prove that I'm right and you're wrong, and just win the argument and not actually persuade you to come join me. And so, like, I am a very persuadable person, for example, like I have probably changed my views, or my views have evolved on a number of issues because I've listened to arguments on one side or the other. And I thought, oh, that is actually a good point. When I think about sort of this healthcare debate and Medicare for all, I do have obviously political considerations in mind in terms of like, okay, what can pass, what can't pass, but I also think substantively about the policy, right? I think about like, okay, well, how do we transition, like what happens to 500,000 whatever people who work in the private insurance industry, right? They're not all executives. Some of them are employees. What should we do? That doesn't mean we shouldn't move to single payer, but it's a consideration, right? Like, how are we going to convince people that, your taxes are going to go up? Yes, you're not going to pay any premiums or copays or deductibles, but if you're healthy, you might not notice that as much, and you're taxes still will go up,
hopefully,
but
healthy people are still getting
it's a better deal for you in the long run, right? Like that's a substantive debate to have. But I feel like sometimes, and I actually think last night in the debate we didn't really get to this. Like the debates are become sort of political debates, and they're like stand-ins for political identity, and we actually don't get into the actual weeds of the policy where there's real good faith debate to be had about all the options.
So I think I agree with that, but I think I might put the onus less even on the candidates on the stage, although there are some who willfully like leaned in and participated in that kind of like politicization of it. But even the questions as they came from the moderators seemed just almost wholly political. I mean, I think the first one out of the gate, I mean, there were questions like, don't you think, you know, you're too socialist to have for these ideas to fly in the Midwest, right? So like I did a radio interview earlier today where the host asked me, you know, isn't it fair to ask whether or not, you know, how you're going to win over Midwestern voters? I said, absolutely, that's a fair question. And I appreciate you bringing that question to me, and I will answer it for you right now. But that's very different than you saying to me, hey, how are you going to sell your socialist snake oil to the Midwest? You know, like there's a way you can kind of like, you know, have a leading question and, you know, project what you obviously feel about the debate onto the stage, and then make it so that the people aren't having a conversation about what it means to have a 4-year transition to Medicare for all versus a 10-year transition to a Medicare Advantage program politically. And instead you're having this question about people's like squishy feelings or at best loose poll numbers. You know, I mean, what did you make of that?
No, I mean, we've been talking about this here. Like, if I had my way, I think that the networks would host the debates, but the moderators would be activists and issue experts who could actually delve into the policy because you do look. This is just how reporters do things. I mean, it's like I don't think they do it out of any malicious intent, but it is sort of, they know that they need to drive to conflict always. And so they also use a lot of shorthand, right? I mean, it takes a long time, as you know, to dig into each one of these issues and to know the policy cold and to know all the details cold of all these policies. And so sometimes you do hear from reporters like sort of a shorthand, and they fall back on the more political questions and questions that are going to elicit conflict, and they're not having like really sort of thoughtful policy debates, and they're not asking thoughtful policy questions instead because they want to figure out where the soundbite's going to come from. And that is not great.
Well, I mean, how do you think that's affecting the voters' understanding of what options are genuinely on the table? Because, you know, I listened to your interview of Senator Sanders, and I was really struck by the fact that if you listen to like the first 10 minutes, I felt like, okay, this is Bernie Sanders sounding like Bernie Sanders. Nothing really new, you know. And then after a while, the conversation kind of warms up and evolves, and he starts to explain the policies. At one point, he walks you through the 4-year transition process, right? That's Medicare for all. You know, at first, everyone 55 and up gets covered, then lower 10 years, then it's everybody, right? And it struck me that, like, I haven't heard many interviews where that aspect of the explanation has come out. And even listening to your show won't get to it just because of the way the conversation happens to unfold unless they listen for, 20, 30 minutes, right?
Well,
and what does that mean that we're having these debates? Because it doesn't take very long to explain, Year 1, 55 and up. Year 2, 45 and up. Year 3, 35 and up. That takes 15 seconds. So what's going on that we have these listenerships, whether it's people who are watching debates, people who are tuning into media all over the place, and we're not able to get where you got the senator?
It's a great question. What's going on? Like, part of me thinks that if we really all talked about the policies themselves and broke them down, one of the issues would be that the contrasts don't seem, or the differences don't seem quite as wide.
Do you think that's true?
I don't know, because my view on some of these Medicare for all debates is we are, except for some of the people who are just doing just like a pure public option, I think they're pretty far away from single payer, right? But on some of these policies, I think we're sort of all arguing about that transition period, like what the transition looks like. And I mean, look, there's plenty of countries around the world that will say they have universal health care. Not all of them are exactly single payer. Some of them have room for private insurance, but they still achieve universal coverage, and they achieve, cost reductions and they control costs very well. So there's a couple different ways to do it.
Sure.
But I think if you broke it down and said, okay, well, Bernie's transition is a 4-year window where we bring it down to 55, and then we bring it up, and then we keep going that way. And Kamala's plan is a 10-year, but at the end you have Medicare Advantage-like plans like we have right now, but they're very tightly regulated. Then, you can sort of see the differences in the two plans, but it doesn't. Where I'm worried is that the difference between Bernie Sanders' plan and Kamala Harris's plan is going to be sort of made to be this like huge monumental difference. And I actually don't see it as that big of a difference. There's definitely trade-offs to each plan. There's pluses and minuses to each plan.
So let's talk about this, Jon.
Figure out like.
I think this is actually a really fascinating place to land, because I think this is also because I can feel what my reaction is, and I can feel the liberal counter reaction, which is to say, leftists are so melodramatic. Why are they always shouting? Bernie got that last night, right? Like, why are you so shouty? Why are you so impassioned about this? These differences are not that significant. And what comes to my head is, okay, the moral argument for Medicare for all, right? The healthcare as a human right, which is a phrase a lot of people have been deploying now, but people who don't actually believe that there needs to be universal coverage, right? So when Bernie Sanders says we should have healthcare as a human right, it means that your financial circumstances should never come between you and life-saving or life-sustaining care, which means that healthcare must be at bottom free at point of service. And that idea of free of point of service is a kind of a detail that doesn't get discussed actually in this conversation. I think Americans have no real concept of what it means to walk into a hospital, see a doctor, and just walk out, right? Just swipe an insurance card, but walk out. Not an insurance card, but, a card that shows that you're from the country, whatever it is, and then walk out, an ID card, whatever it is. And so when we're talking about the difference between the plans, when you're talking about Kamala Harris's plan, which has this 10-year rollout, it's also a political question. It's a question that says, if Obamacare had a 10-year rollout, we'd be sitting in the middle of a rollout with that Donald Trump would have ultimately canceled or done his best to thwart. Right. So these are not just distinctions without a difference. There's the political aspect of it, which says that her plan might not have legs because it's just highly implausible. She's counting on having 2 terms herself plus a Democratic president following her, or, a friendly president following her, a person who's friendly to her policy. And on a substantive level, there are these conversations about plans which ultimately still require people to pay significant amounts in insurance, and which protect Medicare Advantage, which was a Bush era giveaway to the private insurance company that has resulted in $30 billion worth of government waste over the last 3 years. So I'm with you about discussing the details, but I would argue that when you bring out those kind of details, it really concretizes the extent to which one policy really is healthcare as a human right, and one policy is more of this kind of technocratic tinkering that has kind of gotten us into the mess that we're in today.
Do you think that a plan like Kamala's is technocratic tinkering? Like, do you think that, I mean, at the end, obviously, there's the risk, as you mentioned, that if it's a 10-year window, someone else can get elected and upend the whole system, right? I also, was there for implementing the Affordable Care Act, and 4 years for us to implement it. It still wasn't enough time, as you remember from healthcare.gov and all the rest of it. So some of these things just actually take time to move everyone over. But at the end of the 10 years for hers, it seems like every single American is covered. It seems like it is free at point of service for everyone, except for in some of these Medicare Advantage type plans, there may be additional services if you so choose. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's still a bunch of copays and deductibles if you choose those plans.
My understanding was, so it's like a medium post, and not, at this stage at least, a very well developed. I think there's actually just genuinely not a lot of detail. So there's a lot of, part of the issue is there's a lot of projection onto what this is actually going to mean. But I think that the overarching frustration is that in a world where there's been so much work done to push the Overton window, that by some polls at least, Medicare for All has upwards of 70% popularity and a majority of Republicans even support it. To then have someone who's part of your own party and ostensibly part of your own coalition, who is co-signed on to Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, to then offer something that's, offer something less than that. It's confusing and it's difficult to understand that as anything other than an unnecessary political concession. And to whom? Well, then you start to get into these questions of who has taken the pledge not to take money from pharmaceutical companies. And this is where it starts to feel personal. And this is where people who like Kamala Harris, for reasons that I very much understand as an individual and what she represents, start to feel like, well, you're telling me the person that I like, who does great things for a lot of different communities and who's interpersonally charming and, and intelligent and compelling in a lot of ways, is a quote unquote bad person because she took this money from the pharmaceutical industry and now you're telling me she's a shill for them, And it's difficult because I feel like those arguments need to be made because there is a relationship between money and politics and the policies pursued by various people, which is why you see such a distinction between the plans Warren and Sanders put forward and some of the others. But it does become this personalized, emotional kind of sensitive conversation that I'm really hesitant about. I don't want people to feel like I'm attacking their fave when I'm pointing out that I think that their fave might have divided interests.
Well, so I think you guys have a legitimate beef with Kamala Harris for signing on to Bernie's plan at first and then saying, oh, just kidding, I'm going to have a different plan. Right? Because clearly at one point she favored Bernie's plan, right? So the question is, why did she change plans? And to me, it doesn't seem like it had anything to do with, money from insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies, because why wouldn't that have, factored into her consideration the first time she signed on to Bernie Sanders? I think. Can
you stay with that for a second? Why do you? Because if you sign into something in 2017, 3 years before an election season, at a time when people's institutional memories aren't really there, no one's really paying that much attention, I think it's actually pretty common and easy to sign on to any number of bills. People sign on to multiple bills that say different things. Right? Very different Medicare for All programs. People sign on to Pramila Jayapal's plan and Bernie Sanders' plan. Hers is 2 years, ours is 4 years. I don't think that just because it, requires a little bit of flip-flopping, I don't think it's fair to say, oh, why would she do it then if she didn't mean it now? If she were kind of politically captured in some way. I think it is completely consistent with political capture to do something at a time where the politics of it don't matter as much because you're not running for office. And then to change your mind when the field starts to narrow and the interests come into play and the money starts rolling in and you have to court various interest groups.
See, I think, having been in the middle of some of these fights before, I think that sort of what drives a lot of political decisions is fear, right? There is a fear. And I don't know that it's necessarily always fear of corporate interest, though I'm sure that definitely plays into a lot of it. It's fear of what voters want. It's fear of popularity. The one group of people, the one interest group we don't talk about a lot when we get into these policy debates is the voters, right? And what voters think. And I think, I'll use the example of the canceled insurance plans under the Affordable Care Act, right? And this always drove me nuts because everyone was like, oh, these 3 million cancellation notices went out. All these people lost their insurance, blah, blah, blah. And I was sitting there like, we didn't fucking cancel your insurance to take away your health care. We're giving you better insurance. Yeah. The reason that we canceled your insurance plan is because it didn't meet standards that will protect you in a whole bunch of different ways. Like you're getting a better health care plan because of these cancellation notices. But a lot of people had a reaction like, oh, you took away my health care, you took away my plan. I'm scared, right? Like healthcare, as you know, is a very scary thing to a lot of people, right? And that's why it can be so easily, there's so much fear mongering about it, right? That's That's what the insurance industry counts on, right? That they can
and Jake
scare the shit
Tapper.
out of you. But even if there were no insurance companies lobbying for this, even if they weren't pouring, Republicans weren't pouring millions of dollars into ads to scare the shit out of people about healthcare, I think there would still be a whole bunch of people who are like, okay, I know where I get my care now. I feel good about it, and I'm afraid of what change might mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's incumbent on every candidate who wants to change the healthcare system to take the concerns people have about changing the healthcare system
Mm-hmm.
as serious concerns that you need to address and persuade, and not dismissed as, oh, well, because if everyone says, oh, well, Kamala Harris has this other plan because she has, it's just about the insurance companies and whatever else. Someone sitting at home who's not influenced by the insurance companies, who probably hates the insurance companies, is like, well, what about my concern? Like, if I'm going to pay more in taxes for this plan, what am I going to get out of it?
Sure.
And what's going to happen to my doctor? What's going to happen to my network? Right. And
well, those are legitimate questions, though, right?
I've noticed that Bernie's been doing this lately, but I'm surprised that the Medicare for All contingent hasn't talked more about, well, you can keep your doctor because all the doctors are in the same network, right? So, like, to me, that's a great that's a plus for the Medicare for All.
Absolutely. Look, that to me, those are legitimate questions. And when Bernie Sanders goes on the Fox News town hall and is cornered by Republican hosts who basically try to set him up by asking the crowd who here would give up their private insurance company, and almost everyone in the Republican Fox News audience raises their hand. I mean, to me, that says that what the voter is actually concerned about isn't what's being highlighted in most of these political conversations in the media, because the voters, at least as polls suggest, overwhelmingly are in favor of Medicare for All. But even more importantly than that, I think the responsibility is with politicians to push the Overton window, to explain to voters the realm of what is possible. And if you have politicians who, as in 2016, were arguing, back then, the idea of Medicare for All was a complete anathema. It was described as like being like wanting a pony, right? And in this short period of time, we've changed not magically, but because Bernie Sanders has, over the course of the last 3 years, continuously made the case to the American people. So what frustrates, I think, people on the left is when that case has been made and so much progress has been made, and then it feels like some of these candidates are intentionally trying to confuse the issue. They know that Medicare for All is popular, which is why they call their plans Medicare for All or some version of that. They say things like healthcare is a human right, even though they go out of their way to have protections to preserve the private insurance industry. They ask fear-mongering questions, not good questions like, can I keep my doctor? Yes. Fear-mongering questions like, you're trying, Bullock and Delaney asking, you're going to take away Americans' insurance the same way they said about Obamacare, right?
Yeah, I think those attacks are like really disliking where the debate is going, because I think a bunch of people standing up on stage and saying, these plans are going to just take your health care away. It's wrong, right? Like your private insurance is going to change, but you're going to be on a more generous plan. Mm-hmm. I mean, the real debate here is Bernie Sanders is offering a plan that is more generous than almost any Medicare plan or government plan in the world right now, right? Like, everything is paid for. There's all these different services, right? So everything is free. Everything is paid for. It's a good healthcare plan. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not going to get a better healthcare plan. The challenge is going to be financing. We still really haven't talked about financing it, right? Like, it's gonna, when you're going to be that generous on a healthcare plan, it's going to cost some money, right?
But here's the beauty of the Sanders plan, and it gets back to your point about what was going on with the political backlash that happened with the ACA, which is that Bernie has tried to sidestep some of that by being brutally honest in a way that I think a lot of people would advise him not to be, about the fact that, yes, there was going to be a small single digit, percentage raise in taxes for the majority of Americans that, of course, yes, will be offset and much smaller than what you are going to save by not having to pay for health insurance anymore. But he's really tried not to hide the ball on that. Yes, taxes will go up. And, and we have also talked about these right-wing studies, like the McCater study that showed that there's like a $2 trillion overall savings by cutting the waste out of the system, So like, I resist the narrative that we aren't talking about the pay for. If anything, we have been politically stabbed herself in the back by being so upfront about the pay for. But I think that the American people, when I talk to them, when I'm traveling and talking to people in the field, what they say about Bernie Sanders is, at least I know what I'm going to get. And I don't feel like anything's being hidden from me. And so like it does become frustrating when, we're asked again and again and again these same questions that have been asked and answered, when there are these important questions like, well, how does the rollout work? That outside of, your great interview with the senator the other day, we're just not hearing.
Right. No, I mean, look, it's the financing piece is tricky because I got to this with the senator and, said, can you guarantee that no one is going to pay more in taxes than they currently do in premiums? Mm-hmm. And he said yes. But I do think, look, this is the sort of the fundamental challenge with the politics around healthcare and has been forever. If you are healthy and relatively well off, you don't use much healthcare, so you don't pay a lot, maybe in premiums and copays and deductibles. The whole point of healthcare is everyone's going to get sick at some point, and when you get sick, you're going to need it. But that's still it's still an argument that you have to make to people, that the whole point of insurance is that, like, because there's a whole bunch of people running around who think like, oh, I'm fine. I don't think people don't think about their premiums sometimes, because some employers cover 80 up to 100% of their healthcare, right? So they don't see that some of their wages are actually they're going towards their healthcare. So I do think there's this need to tell people, okay, your taxes are going up, which Bernie is being very honest about. And even if you're one of those people who's not shelling out from your own pocket, or at least it doesn't seem like your own pocket, premiums every single month, you're not going to the doctors, you're not using a lot of healthcare. You have a heart attack, you get cancer, someone in your family gets really sick, you're going to be really happy that you have quality free healthcare, and you're not going to mind that you, by the way, paid 4% more in taxes this year. It's going to be a good deal. But it's just, so I just think that's
for sure there are some people for whom that's going to be an argument. But what I've learned, because I will admit to being in a bubble, right? Like, I was a corporate lawyer. I was a journalist living in New York, and I'm not going to pretend to be anything that I'm not. But what I have learned about working on this campaign, my second week on the job, I run this podcast, and we did our second episode was about healthcare, and I sent a message out on the Slack channel asking if anybody would be willing to tell me their healthcare stories. I thought everyone here is really young. No one here is, obviously, people are healthy enough to work. I thought this is a sensitive issue. People aren't going to want to share their stories with me. I was inundated with responses. And it was because, as much as people are young and healthy, if you have had any experience at all with the healthcare system, it is one that is more often than not traumatizing. And that episode, the second episode of Hear the Bern, is one of the most powerful episodes we've done to date, because I'm sitting next to a 20-year-old type 1 diabetic who's also dealing with being told she's not going to get financial aid on her student loans. And there's this intersection of everything that Bernie Sanders is talking about and this real kind of working class everyday agenda that doesn't actually need that much of a sell or a pitch, I find, outside of the Beltway. And then this is, I think, reflected in who it is that supports the campaign. I mean, there were just new numbers out today that showed that only 4% of Sanders voters make more than $100,000 a year. 4%. Now, the next lowest is Andrew Yang at 18%. Harris is also 18%. Biden, 18%. Warren, 20%. Buttigieg, 37% earn over $100,000 a year, right? And so Bernie is getting it's like this elite agenda, and how are you going to sell people on this? And Bernie bros are these white guys with like kerchiefs and beards in Brooklyn and all this. but the reality is, we have disproportionately Black and brown and working class, non-college educated support. And so part of it is just, it's this like, the frustration is this like a media mind F-U-C-K, where it's like, that I think is where some of the tension and why you find the debate happening on Twitter more. Because in the real world, people know the answer. There's no tough sell. On Twitter, it's like, I know Black people more than you know Black people. And there's like white middle-aged ladies telling me I need to, learn something about Black women before. It's like this crazy proxy battle, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, if I were to sum it up, I think that sometimes the left looks at the center left and thinks that they have sort of bad motivations, either motivations based on like political ambition or financial or who they're listening to or whatever else, and that they're only thinking about sort of political strategy. And then I think on the flip side, the center left's problem is they look at the left and think, okay, their heart's in the right place, their motivation is good, but they don't get politics and they don't understand politics. And I think both sides are wrong about the other sides. Like I believe and have seen and come to realize that like the left does have a political strategy. They do understand politics, but their view of politics is that like you've got to build a movement and and you do have to sort of like take on very powerful forces, and that you know there is a method to the madness here. But having been, you know, look, I come from an interesting perspective because Barack Obama was never a Bernie Sanders or even an Elizabeth Warren, but we did take on the Clintons, and we were the sort of outsider candidate against the establishment. Right. So I know what it's like to run against someone who is always telling you, like, no, you can't have this. No, this isn't feasible. You're just making false promises. You're giving people false hope. Like, it is infuriating, right? Because you're saying, like, I thought that the purpose of running for president and building a political and social movement was to inspire people to something better, you know?
Change.
But it's changed. But then I've also been in the White House, and you realize that, like, it's a daily grind. And I've seen that, like, the things that we couldn't get done were not because like a bunch of, you know, special interests were like whispering in our ear, or because Barack Obama's like, fuck it, I just need to get reelected, so I'm going to do this. It's because it's really hard to sort of change public opinion, bring people together, and also have a citizenry that is not only with you, but willing to then push on their elected officials to make sure that they act in the right way too. I mean, like, we had a Senate most of the time in the White House where there's a bunch of red state Democrats who were basically like Republicans. They're not there anymore. But, you know, like, we never had a progressive majority to do anything. But what it looks like from the outside sometimes is it's not that we didn't have this progressive majority, but that, like, you know, Obama was just some centrist who didn't really want to bring about change.
And I don't think that that's what it is, but I don't think that that's what the left thinks of Obama. What I think that what we believe is that, you know, there was an energized, mobilized group that was incredibly excited to help carry that grassroots movement through his candidacy. But that the grassroots establishment was dismantled when he became president and not attended to in the way that it could have if people had the administration had the same understanding of how beneficial that kind of a movement could have been to its insider political objectives, you know, once it's actually in the Oval. And when we're talking, I think there's an awareness that it was difficult. I mean, you know, that Lieberman blew the whole public option. You know, like, we know that there are bad actors who were derailing the process, including among Democrats. But it's also true, I think our worldview is, why were those actors bad? Why were they doing the wrong thing? Well, because there's different interests in different localities across the country that different populations feel like they have to be attended to. Different legislators have to be attended to. And if there were that grassroots movement that they would have to be more beholden to in Kentucky and in Ohio and in Florida and not just on the coast, that they would know that they would have to follow the president's mandate and not capitulate to those special interests. So I don't think we're trying to blame anybody individually.
No, right. And look, if we had to do it over again, we would absolutely try much harder to keep that movement alive. I do think among voters sometimes, and this is work that we all have to do, there is this, or there has been in the past, this sort of transactional view of what politics is. So there's a lot of young people who are really excited about Barack Obama, but they voted for him in 2008. And the idea was, all right, I'm going to give you my vote. Now you go fix the world, and I'm going to go back to my life and just focus on other shit. And I think we have learned through 8 years of Obama and now under the Trump presidency that that's never going to be possible anymore. Like, democracy is not transactional. And I think it's funny because I think Bernie, to me, is the only candidate right now who is really talking about the need for a movement. Like, I really like that you guys do It's Not Me, It's Us. You know, Obama used to say that quite a bit. And I do think, like, whoever is the next Democratic president, I don't care how talented, how left or center left or whatever that person is, they're not going to get anything done without a movement pushing on the Republican in Congress who are still going to be there blocking the president's agenda. Like, this has to be a movement, for in perpetuity.
Yeah. I mean, that fact alone is why I'm here. That fact alone is why I believe, as much as, Warren, there are other actors in the world that I should broadly share my politics, but the reason why I chose to leave a job I really loved at The Intercept and come work for the Bernie Sanders campaign is because of that understanding of what it takes to transform this country, and that emphasis. And I hope that all voters who have been members of various coalitions, the Obama coalition, the Clinton coalition, can appreciate that as not just a slogan, but as core to a political project. When people talk about, can Bernie get things done? What is he going to accomplish? How is he going to do it? And they want to talk about packing the court and stuff like that. That the coalition itself, the not me, us, is perhaps the most important political tool that we have. And when people ask, how are we going to win? And they want to talk about polls, I want to talk about 2 million individual donations. A record for presidential campaigns at this point, followed at best by someone who is like the next best person has 1 million, right? The number of donations and the number of people showing up to rallies and people who are joining our house parties and things like that. Those are people on the ground, people who have been inspired by Bernie Sanders advocating for a $15 minimum wage at Amazon, at Walmart. Most of our donors, the most common employer of our donors is Walmart. And, that's something that we're very proud of. And I hope that translates into broader audiences who I think can sometimes perceive that lingo as performative in a way that is absolutely not.
Well, because honestly, one of the major forces that we're battling against is cynicism. Is a deep cynicism about politics, about government. And it's funny, I did when I did the Wilderness, this podcast about the Democratic Party, I did focus groups with Obama Trump voters in Michigan, but then I did a focus group with Obama voters who then either voted for a third party or stayed at home in Texas. And, as you can imagine, that focus group was younger, more in their 20s, people of color, women, and it's not, they definitely share progressive views and progressive values, but the reason that they don't want to be involved in politics it's not even ideological, right? Like, a lot of them are just so cynical that anything good could ever happen. And so getting them involved is not necessarily like, well, my position, but do you like Medicare for all, or do you like this or that? I think they're willing to listen to us on all these issues, and they're probably more likely to be with us on all these issues. But you've got to get past this barrier of them just thinking that politics is bullshit, that it's never going to matter, that we're never going to get anything done. And that's a real challenge to reach those voters. And I think, we've seen some candidates can do that. Like Bernie can clearly, some of them were Bernie supporters in the primary, but some of them were just like, no, I liked Obama because he was really inspiring to me, but I still like him, but nothing really got done. And now I just think, no one's listening to me, and I don't want to be part of politics anymore. I
agree that cynicism is our biggest enemy, perhaps bigger than Trump. And I think that's part of why there's frustration when you have candidates coming in, when we've moved the Overton window, who say, oh, actually, we don't even have to go that far. And I think that cynicism didn't come out of nowhere. It was kind of designed. We've been told for a long time that we couldn't have nice things. And I think, and we talked about this when we first started our conversation, there's a way that when the world starts to shift to the left or shift away from center, that people can start to feel left behind. And suddenly, if all of these things are possible, what does that mean about me? Psychologically, I think about this a lot. Like, what does that mean about me to have been fighting for incrementalism or a more moderate stance for all these years when I could have been asking for more? And for me to admit that things could have been better is somehow, in some ways, like an indictment of self. And I'm really fascinated by that psychology and ways to make people feel like, AOC in an interview I did with her in March called it like the Golden Gate of retreat, like giving people a graceful way to say, hey, actually, like, this is your movement too. And we were all confused. None of us, we had all been like red pilled. And now it's time to like take the blinders off. No judgment.
Well, honestly, so a great example of that, I just thought about it because of AOC, is that funny fucking Onion story where they were like, oh, New Jersey Congressman Bill Pascrell wants to be a member of the squad,
Yeah.
and he tweets something funny like, yeah, I'd love to join. And AOC tweets back, we'd love to have you as a
Right.
member of the squad. Like, I do think there's something to be, because so much of what we all talk about every day as activists is substance, policy, building movements, stuff like that. But there is this sort of, political in a small p way that is sort of like reaching out to people and
Yeah.
saying, come along with us. And if you haven't been with us before, that's okay. It's not a big deal. We've all had different views, but we're trying to come together now because there's something about, it's not just about Trump. It's about something bigger. It's about our democracy. And we want you as part of our movement. That's why I thought like, Bernie's America ad last time around in 2016 was a very powerful ad because it sort of evokes these feelings of patriotism in sort of the best sense of the word and sort of the progressive sense of the word. But it was inviting, it made you want to be part of it. And I think that's really important to building any kind of movement.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. I've been wanting to do this forever, and you have to know that there's an open door. Please come back anytime.
I will do so, and thank you for having me. And we'll have to get you guys on Pod Save America so we can chat more.
Would love that. Absolutely.
All right.
Have a good one.
Take care, Briahna. Thank you.